They said money could fix anything, but everyone in the Hamptons knew that the Thorne estate was the exception. They whispered that the mansion on the cliff wasn't a home, but a fortress built to keep secrets in and the world out. Julian Thorne was a man who could command Wall Street with a whisper, a man who built empires from dust, yet in his own hallway, he was a king without a kingdom. His 4 children, the quadruplets, were not just difficult, they were legendary. They had driven away 14 nannies in 3 weeks. The agencies had stopped picking up the phone. The local church had stopped sending prayers. And now nanny number 15 was about to break the world record for the fastest exit in history. It started with a sound that would haunt the staff for years. A crash so loud it shook the crystal chandelier in the foyer, followed by the shattering of porcelain. Then came the screaming. It wasn't the children. It was Miss Higgins, a woman with 30 years of experience who claimed she could tame wild horses. But right now, she was running for her life. The heavy oak doors of the nursery flew open, banging violently against the walls. Miss Higgins didn't just walk out, she scrambled. She slipped on the polished marble floor because her shoes were slick with something red. It looked like blood, but the sharp smell of vinegar gave it away. It was ketchup, gallons of it, and she was covered from head to toe in white flour, looking like a ghost that had been dragged through a bakery from hell. Julian stood at the bottom of the stairs, his hand frozen halfway to his tie. He had just come home early hoping for peace. He didn't expect a war zone. Miss Higgins, he called out, his voice echoing in the large, cold hall. Please, just wait, wait! The woman spun around. Her eyes were wide terror etched into every wrinkle of her face. She wiped a glob of ketchup from her eye, her hand shaking violently. Mr. Thorne, I served in the Peace Corps. I have lived in jungles. But that room upstairs, that is not a nursery. That is a cage for demons. Julian pulled his checkbook from his jacket pocket. It was his only defense, his only weapon against the chaos. I will pay you double, triple. Just stay until the weekend. Please, I have a board meeting. I cannot be here alone with them. Miss Higgins laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that bounced off the high ceilings. She backed away toward the heavy front door, fumbling blindly for the handle. You could give me the deed to this house and I wouldn't step foot in there again. They don't want a nanny, sir. They want blood. Keep your money. I would rather starve on the street than spend another minute with those 4 devils. She yanked the door open, letting in a gust of storm wind that swirled the flour around the hall like mist. With one final horrified look at the darkness upstairs, she ran out into the rain, leaving the front door wide open. Julian stood alone in the sudden silence. But the silence didn't last. From the top of the stairs, the nursery door began to rattle. Thump, thump, thump. It was a rhythmic, heavy pounding, as if something was throwing itself against the wood, testing the lock. Julian looked up. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. He walked to the antique table near the entrance, placed his checkbook down, and signed a check for the agency fee. His pen tore through the paper in frustration. He didn't go upstairs to comfort them. He couldn't. He turned his back on the shaking door, poured himself a drink with a trembling hand, and closed his eyes, not knowing that the only person who could save him was currently driving a beat-up van through his security gates. The silence in the hallway was heavier than the noise had been. It was broken by the sharp, rhythmic click of stiletto heels on the marble floor. Vanessa Sterling did not walk, she glided. She came down the grand staircase looking like a runway model who had taken a wrong turn into a disaster zone. Her dress was white silk, immaculate and expensive, a stark contrast to the flour and ketchup that coated the walls. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Lying near her feet was a dirty sneaker left behind by the fleeing nanny. It was a cheap shoe, scuffed and stained. Vanessa looked at it with a curl of her lip. She did not pick it up. She did not call for a maid. Instead, she extended her foot and kicked the shoe across the floor into a corner, as if it were a dead rat. The gesture was small, but it told you everything you needed to know about her heart. She walked over to Julian, who was still staring at the checkbook in his hand. She did not offer him a hug. She did not ask if he was okay. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a glossy brochure. She slid it across the antique table until it rested under his hand. The cover of the brochure featured a high gray wall and barbed wire. The words, Ironwood Military Academy for Troubled Youth, were printed in bold black letters that looked like prison bars. It is time, Julian. Vanessa said, her voice smooth and cool like polished glass. We cannot keep doing this. That was the 15th nanny. The agency has blacklisted us. The staff is terrified. You have to face the truth. Julian looked down at the brochure. His hand trembled slightly. Ironwood. It is a reform school, Vanessa. They use solitary confinement. They use physical discipline. My children are 7 years old. They are grieving. They are not criminals. Are they grieving Julian? Or are they just like her? The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian looked up, his eyes wide with pain. Don't say that. Vanessa stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but her grip was firm. I love you, and I want to be a mother to them. But we have to be realistic. Your late wife was not well. We both know the mental instability ran deep in her bloodline. Look at them. The violence, the screaming, the lack of empathy. It is not just grief. It is genetics. They are broken. Julian, just like she was. And if you don't fix it now, they will destroy you. And they will destroy us. Julian pulled away from her, but he didn't have the strength to argue. The doubt had been planted deep in his mind. He looked at the closed door of the nursery. He remembered the screaming. He remembered the chaos. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was fighting a battle he had already lost. Vanessa saw his hesitation and pressed her advantage. I cannot live in a war zone. I cannot raise my children in a house where I am afraid to walk down the hallway. Send them to Ironwood. Let the professionals handle them, for their sake and for ours. Julian took a deep breath. The air smelled of vinegar and expensive perfume, a nauseating mix. He looked at the brochure again. He felt like he was signing a death warrant, but he was so tired. So incredibly tired. 1 week, he whispered, his voice cracking. Vanessa raised an eyebrow, waiting for more. I will give it 1 more week, Julian said, looking her in the eye. I will try to find one last person, someone different. If it doesn't work by next Friday, then I will sign the papers for Ironwood. Vanessa smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the satisfied smile of a predator who had just cornered its prey. 1 week, darling, she said, smoothing the lapel of his jacket. But do not blame me when the next one runs out screaming too. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a victory march on the marble. Julian stood alone in the ruin of his home, holding the brochure that promised to take his children away forever. He didn't know that the person who would challenge that promise was already pulling up to the service gate in a rusted van, ready to start a war of her own. The iron gates of the Thorne estate loomed over the road like the entrance to a fortress, not a home. They were designed to keep the world out, but today they were opening for a rusted white van that had seen better decades, let alone better days. The side of the van read, Sparkle Clean Services, in peeling blue letters. It sputtered as it idled, waiting for the security camera to focus. Simone Davis rolled down the window. The humid air of the Hamptons hit her face, carrying the scent of salt water and old money. She didn't look like she belonged here. Her uniform was gray and worn at the elbows. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors, and before that from years of scrubbing up for surgery. The security guard stepped out of his booth. He looked at the van with open disdain, his hand resting near his belt. He didn't see a woman. He saw a nuisance. Delivery entrance is around back, he barked. And if you are the new nanny, turn around. Mr. Thorne isn't seeing anyone else today. I am not a nanny, Simone said, her voice low and steady. I am the cleanup crew. Dispatch said you had a code red. The guard blinked. He checked his clipboard. then looked back at her with a smirk that was somehow worse than his anger. Right. The maid. Go on through. Try not to leak oil on the driveway. Simone didn't take the bait. She shifted gears and drove past him, her eyes fixed on the massive stone mansion ahead. She had learned a long time ago that dignity wasn't something people gave you, it was something you kept for yourself. She parked near the service entrance. The head butler was waiting for her. He was a tall man who looked like he had been starched along with his collar. He held a clipboard as if it were a shield. Name, he asked without looking up. Simone Davis. The butler thrust the clipboard at her. Before you step 1 foot inside, you will sign this. It is a non-disclosure agreement. 20 pages. It states that anything you see in this house stays in this house. You do not speak to the press. You do not post on social media. You do not even tell your priest. If you violate this, my employer will sue you for everything you will ever own. Simone looked at the thick stack of papers. She needed this job. Her rent was late and the lights in her apartment were 1 week away from being cut off. She took the pen. She didn't read the fine print. She knew what it said. It said that rich people had secrets that poor people had to clean up. She signed her name with a flourish. Done, she said, handing it back. Now show me the disaster. The butler led her through the winding corridors. The house was beautiful, cold, and silent. But as they approached the east wing, the smell hit her. It was the sharp tang of vinegar mixed with something sweet and rotting. The butler stopped in front of a double door. He unlocked it with a keycard and stepped back quickly, as if afraid something might jump out. Good luck, he muttered. Simone pushed the door open. The room was a catastrophe. It looked less like a nursery and more like the aftermath of a hurricane. Furniture was overturned. Red paint dripped from the crown molding like blood. Feathers from ripped pillows covered the floor like snow. But Simone didn't gasp. She didn't put a hand over her mouth in shock. She just walked in her boots, crunching over broken glass. She set her bucket down and looked around. Her eyes scanned the room with the precision of the nurse she used to be. She saw the violence, yes, but she also saw the details. She saw that the red paint wasn't just thrown randomly. It was concentrated on the windows as if trying to block out the light. She stepped over a pile of shattered porcelain and bent down. Lying on the floor amidst the ruin was a torn piece of paper. It was a drawing. It had been ripped in half, but Simone could still make out the image. It wasn't a scribble. It was a picture of 4 small stick figures, standing inside a box, crying black tears. Simone ran her thumb over the drawing. She looked up at the empty, silent room. You aren't bad kids, are you? She whispered to the empty air. You are just trapped. She folded the drawing and put it in her pocket. Then she picked up her mop. She wasn't just going to clean this floor. She was going to uncover whatever was buried underneath the mess. The silence inside the nursery was a trap. Simone knew it the moment she stepped over the threshold. The room was vast, filled with expensive toys that looked like they had been destroyed by a hurricane, but there were no children in sight. She didn't call out for them. She didn't ask where they were. She simply set her bucket down on a patch of dry carpet and waited. Then came the signal. A small, shrill whistle cut through the air. Suddenly, the closet doors burst open. From behind the curtains, from under the bed, from the attached bathroom, 4 small figures launched themselves into the center of the room. Liam, Noah, Ava, and Mia, the Quadruplets. They were armed not with toys, but with modified water guns filled with thick red industrial paint. Attack, shouted a voice. It was Liam, the ringleader. The assault was immediate and brutal. Streams of red paint hit Simone squarely in the chest, splashing across her face and soaking into her gray uniform. It was designed to humiliate. It was designed to terrify. Every other nanny had screamed. Every other nanny had covered her face and run for the door begging for mercy. But Simone Davis was not from the Hamptons. She was from a neighborhood where loud noises usually meant you hit the floor, not the door. She did not flinch. She did not raise her hands to shield her eyes. She stood perfectly still, planting her work boots firmly on the floor. She closed her eyes for a brief second, took a deep breath, and let the paint hit her. She became a statue in the center of their chaos. The children kept firing until their tanks were empty. They panted heavily, adrenaline coursing through their small veins, waiting for the payoff. They waited for the tears. They waited for the anger. But when the last drop of paint fell, silence returned to the room. Simone slowly wiped one eye with her thumb so she could see. She looked at the 4 children standing in a semicircle around her. They were frozen. Their mouths hung open in confusion. Their weapon had failed. The monster they were trying to scare away was just standing there looking at them with a calm that was more terrifying than any shouting match. "You missed a spot," Simone said calmly, pointing to her left shoulder. The children stepped back. They didn't know what to do. The script they had written for every adult in their lives had just been rewritten. Simone took a step forward. The children flinched, expecting a slap. But Simone wasn't looking at the paint guns. Her eyes, trained by years in the emergency room, were scanning their faces. She looked at Mia, who was trembling. She looked at Noah, who was hiding his hands behind his back. And then she looked at Liam. The boy had dropped his paint gun. He was standing slightly apart from the others. At first glance, he looked like he was just out of breath from the exertion. But Simone saw the way his chest was heaving. It wasn't a rhythm of exertion. It was a rhythm of panic. Liam grabbed his throat with both hands. His eyes, which had been full of rage seconds ago, were now wide with terror. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a high-pitched wheeze that sounded like a broken whistle. The other children laughed nervously, thinking it was part of a game. "Look, Liam is doing the zombie face," Ava giggled. Simone didn't laugh. She dropped her mop. The stoic statue vanished, and the trauma nurse took over. She saw the color draining from his face, turning his lips a terrifying shade of violet. He wasn't playing. He was dying. Liam fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the air as his airway sealed shut. Simone began to run. The sound that came from Liam was not a scream. It was a terrifying wet wheeze, like a vacuum sealing shut. He clawed at his throat, his fingernails digging into his own skin, leaving angry red welts. His eyes bulged, and his face turned from red to a suffocating purple. The other children stopped laughing. They backed away, terrified by the sudden silence of their brother. Simone did not hesitate. The mop handle hit the floor with a loud clatter. She didn't run like a maid. She ran like a trauma nurse responding to a code blue. She slid across the polished floor onto her knees, beside the boy, grabbing his wrist to check for a pulse that was already thready and weak. But before she could assess his airway, the nursery door slammed open. Vanessa stood there, her face twisted in a mask of horrified accusation. "Oh my God," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at Simone. "She is choking him. Look, she is hurting my son because of the paint. Security, get in here. Kill her if you have to." 2 massive bodyguards plowed into the room. They didn't assess the situation. They only heard the order of the future mistress of the house. One of them grabbed Simone by the back of her gray uniform, hauling her up and away from the dying boy. The other twisted her arm behind her back. "Let me go," Simone shouted, struggling against the mountain of muscle. "He is in anaphylaxis. He is dying. Look at him." "Shut up, you animal," Vanessa shrieked, rushing over to pull Liam away, not realizing she was making it worse by forcing him to lie flat. "You are going to jail for this." Liam's eyes rolled back in his head. His chest stopped moving. Something inside Simone snapped. It was the same fire that had made her stand up to corrupt doctors in the Bronx. She didn't just struggle, she became a force of nature. She stomped her heavy work boot down onto the guard's instep, crushing the small bones. As he loosened his grip, she threw her head back, smashing it into his nose. She broke free. But she didn't run for the door. She turned to face the room and let out a roar that shook the glass in the window frames. "Give me my bag." The voice was so primal, so filled with absolute command, that the second guard froze. Vanessa stopped screaming. Even Julian, who had just run into the room, skid to a halt, paralyzed by the sheer power of her presence. "He is not playing," Simone bellowed, pointing at the limp body on the floor. "His throat is closed. Give me the bag, or you are all murderers." She didn't wait. She dove for her cleaning cart, ripping the zipper of her personal bag open. Her hand closed around the yellow plastic tube she always carried for emergencies, the EpiPen. She scrambled back to Liam. Vanessa tried to block her again, but Julian grabbed his fiancé's arm, pulling her back with a force he didn't know he had. "Let her," Julian whispered, his eyes locked on his dying son. Simone tore the safety cap off with her teeth. She gripped Liam's thigh. 1, 2, 3. She jammed the needle down. The mechanism clicked loudly in the silent room. She held it there, counting the seconds, as the adrenaline pumped into the boy's system, fighting the histamines that were drowning him. "Come on, baby. Come on," Simone prayed, her voice cracking. "Breathe for me. Just one breath." For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Liam lay still, like a broken doll. The only sound was the rain beating against the window and Vanessa's ragged breathing. Then a gasp. It was loud and desperate. Liam's back arched off the floor as his lungs expanded, pulling in the sweet oxygen. He coughed violently, spewing saliva and mucus, but he was breathing. The purple hue began to fade from his lips, replaced by a rush of pink. Simone collapsed back on her heels, trembling from the adrenaline dump. She pulled the crying boy into her lap, rocking him back and forth, burying her face in his hair. "I got you," she whispered over and over. "I got you. You are safe." Julian stood over them, staring down. He looked at the paint covering Simone's chest. He looked at the bodyguards nursing their injuries. And he looked at his son, alive and clinging to the neck of a cleaning lady he had tried to fire 10 minutes ago. He realized with a sickening jolt that if he had listened to Vanessa, his son would be dead. He looked at Simone, and for the first time, he didn't see a servant. He saw the only person in the world who knew how to save them. The room was silent except for the steady rhythm of Liam's breathing. He was asleep in Simone's lap, his small hand clutching the fabric of her uniform. Julian Thorne looked at the scene, then he turned his gaze to Vanessa. His fiancée was standing near the door, smoothing her dress, her face a mask of indignation rather than relief. "She is dangerous, Julian," Vanessa hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Simone. "She assaulted a member of the security team. She drugged your son. You cannot possibly let her stay here." Julian walked over to Vanessa. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hand. He simply looked at her with the cold detachment of a CEO firing an incompetent employee. "He is alive because of her," Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than a scream. "You gave him a peanut butter cookie. You almost killed him. Now get out." Vanessa's mouth fell open. "Excuse me." "Get out of the nursery," Julian repeated. "And take your security guards with you. I don't want to see you until dinner." Vanessa turned a shade of crimson. She looked at Simone with pure venom, then spun on her heel and stormed out, the guards trailing behind her like beaten dogs. When the door clicked shut, Julian let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for years. He walked over to Simone and knelt down so he was eye level with her. He saw the paint on her face, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, and he knew he had found something rare. "I will pay you $20,000 a month," Julian said. Simone looked up. She didn't blink at the number, though it was more money than she had made in the last year combined. "I will double what the agency pays." Julian continued, his voice desperate. "Full benefits. Use of the guest cottage. Just say yes. Be their nanny." Simone gently shifted Liam so his head rested on a pillow. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked around the destroyed room, then at the billionaire kneeling on the floor. "I don't want your money to buy my silence, Mr. Thorne," Simone said, her voice steady. "If I take this job, it is not going to be like the others. I am not here to be a servant you can order around while your fiancé plays house." Name your terms, Julian said without hesitation. Simone held up 3 fingers. First, I control the kitchen. No more sugar, no more processed garbage, and absolutely no food from that woman. I cook everything from scratch. Second, I want full access to the security system. I want to see every corner of this house, especially when I am not in the room. Done. Julian nodded. And the third? Simone's eyes hardened. She pointed at the door where Vanessa had just exited. She does not step foot in this nursery, Simone said. When I am teaching them, when I am feeding them, she is not allowed near them. She triggers them. I can see it. If she walks in, I walk out. Julian paused. Banning his future wife from his children's room was a declaration of war. But then he looked at Liam sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Agreed, Julian said. You have full authority. You answer only to me. Simone nodded. Then we have a deal. She walked to the door to retrieve her mop bucket. As she reached for the handle, she saw a shadow through the small gap between the door and the frame. It was a single eye watching them. Vanessa was standing in the hallway, pressing her ear against the wood. The look in that eye wasn't just anger. It was a promise of vengeance. Simone stared right back until the shadow moved away. She knew the check had been signed, but the real battle had just begun. The morning sun flooded the kitchen, but it didn't bring any warmth. Vanessa Sterling was already awake, standing over the kitchen island like a witch brewing a potion. She wasn't cooking eggs. She was pouring a thick amber stream of high-fructose syrup over 4 bowls of neon-colored Fruit Loops. The cereal was already 40% sugar, but Vanessa drowned it until the milk turned a sickly sweet sludge. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew that in 20 minutes this sugar bomb would hit their bloodstreams and turn them into screaming, wall-climbing, uncontrollable terrors. Just in time for Julian to come down for breakfast and see his children acting like animals again. She smiled as she stirred the syrup in hiding the evidence. Suddenly a hand reached out and snatched the bowl away. Simone stood there holding the bowl. She didn't look sleepy. She looked ready for war. She walked to the trash can and dumped the entire contents inside with a loud, wet thud. She did the same with the second bowl. Then the third. Then the fourth. Vanessa gasped, dropping the syrup bottle. What do you think you are doing, you insolent servant? Those were their favorites. You are poisoning them, Simone said, her voice calm but dangerous. You are filling them with red dye number 40 and enough sugar to stop a heart. Not on my watch. Simone reached into the fridge and pulled out 4 bowls of steel-cut oatmeal topped with fresh berries and flax seeds. It looked brown. It looked boring. It looked healthy. Vanessa laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. Good luck with that. If they don't get their sugar, they will tear this kitchen apart. And I will be right here to film it for Julian. As if on cue, the 4 children stormed into the kitchen. They stopped. They looked at the table. They expected their colorful, sugary bowls. Instead, they saw the brown mush. Liam's face twisted into a snarl. He grabbed his bowl and raised it, ready to hurl it across the room. Noah kicked the leg of the chair, screaming a high-pitched sound that grated on the nerves. Ava and Mia began to sweep the silverware onto the floor. It was the start of the daily riot. Vanessa leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms with a smirk, waiting for the inevitable destruction. But Simone didn't yell. She didn't beg. She slammed her hand down on the marble island, a single sharp slap that cut through the noise. The children froze, looking at her. Simone held their gaze. She didn't speak. She raised her hands. Her fingers moved with precision and grace. She touched her forehead, then moved her hands down in a deliberate chopping motion. Then she pointed to the food and then to her own eyes. It was American Sign Language, but it wasn't just random signs. She signed, I know you are pretending. I know you are smart. Eat this, and you will be strong enough to fight her. She jerked her head slightly toward Vanessa without looking at her. The effect was instant. Liam lowered the bowl, his mouth hung open. For years, everyone had treated them like they were broken, like they were mindless monsters. But this woman just spoke to them in the only language they respected, the language of secrets. Liam looked at Noah. Noah looked at the oatmeal. Slowly, hesitantly, Liam sat down. He picked up his spoon. He took a bite. It was bland, but he swallowed it. The others followed his lead. The kitchen went silent. The only sound was the clinking of spoons against china. Vanessa's smirk vanished. She pushed herself off the counter, her eyes wide with confusion. She looked from the children to Simone, trying to understand what had just happened. She had expected a war. Instead, she was watching a truce. "Eat up," Simone said aloud, her voice casual as she poured herself a coffee. "We have a big day ahead of us, and we are going to need all our strength." The nursery was quiet for the first time in years. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a held breath. The four children sat on their beds watching Simone as she folded laundry. They were waiting. They were always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the yelling to start, for the punishments to begin. But Simone just hummed a low melody as she worked, ignoring the cameras that blinked in the corners like red eyes. Then the sound started. It was faint at first. A rhythmic clicking noise. Click, click, click. Simone paused. She looked at Noah, the quietest of the four. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, staring blankly at the wall. But his finger was moving. He was tapping his fingernail against the wooden bed frame. Click, click, click. A pause. Clack, clack, clack. A pause. Click, click, click. To anyone else, it would have sounded like a nervous tick. To Vanessa, it was proof that the boy was mentally unstable, a symptom of the madness she claimed ran in their blood. She had called it stimming. She had called it annoying. She had even tied his hands together once to make him stop. But Simone Davis didn't hear madness. She heard a pattern. She stopped folding the shirt in her hand. She stood perfectly still, tilting her head. She listened to the rhythm again. 3 short taps. 3 long taps. 3 short taps. The hair on Simone's arms stood up. It wasn't random. It wasn't a nervous habit. It was the most universal language of distress in the world. SOS, save our souls. Simone looked at Noah. His face was empty, devoid of emotion, but his finger kept moving, tapping out the plea over and over again into the void. He was calling for help right under the nose of the woman who wanted to lock him away. He was screaming without opening his mouth. A wave of sorrow hit Simone, followed immediately by a wave of cold fury. They weren't broken. They were terrified. They were trapped in a house that wanted them gone, and this tapping was their lifeline. They were geniuses hiding inside the shell of trauma. Simone didn't rush over to him. She knew the cameras were watching. She knew Vanessa was probably monitoring the feed, looking for any excuse to fire her. If she acknowledged it verbally, Vanessa would know the secret. So Simone did something dangerous. She walked over to the wooden desk in the center of the room. She picked up a book and set it down. Then she placed her hand flat on the wood. She waited until Noah looked at her out of the corner of his eye. Then she tapped. Clack, clack, clack. 3 short. Clack, clack, clack. 3 long. Clack, clack, clack. 3 short. The sound echoed in the quiet room. Noah's fingers stopped midair. Slowly, slowly, he turned his head. For the first time since she arrived, he looked her full in the face. His eyes were wide with shock. He wasn't looking at a nanny anymore. He was looking at an ally. Then Liam turned, then Ava, then Mia. The 4 of them sat up straight. The mask of insanity slipped. The blank stares vanished, replaced by a sharp, intelligent focus. They realized that someone had finally heard them. Someone had finally decoded the signal. Simone picked up the laundry basket. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just looked at them with a fierce, protective intensity and nodded once. Message received, she thought. She turned and walked toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. The game had changed. They weren't just her charges anymore. They were her partners, and together they were going to burn Vanessa's lies to the ground. Julian Thorne sat alone in his corner office on the 45th floor of the Thorne Tower. The city of New York sprawled beneath him, a grid of golden lights and endless ambition, but Julian felt none of it. He was a man who commanded billions, yet he dreaded opening his own laptop. For the past year, checking the Nanny cam feed had been a daily ritual of torture. He would log in and see chaos. He would see nannies crying. He would see his children throwing furniture, screaming in that terrifying synchronized harmony that made his blood run cold. He took a sip of cold coffee and hovered his finger over the enter key. He needed to know if the new woman Simone had quit yet. He needed to know if the house was still standing. He exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding and pressed the key. The screen flickered to life. Julian flinched instinctively, bracing himself for the violence. But there was no screaming. There was no breaking glass. The nursery was bathed in the soft afternoon light that filtered through the freshly cleaned windows. In the center of the room sat a small wooden table. Ava, the youngest of the quadruplets, was sitting there. Usually Ava was the one who bit people. She was the feral one, the one Vanessa called the little wolf. But today she was sitting perfectly still, holding a paintbrush. Simone was kneeling beside her. She wasn't looming over the child with authority, she was down at her level. Julian turned up the volume, expecting to hear orders. Instead, he heard a soft humming. Simone was guiding Ava's hand, not forcing it. They were painting a sunflower. It wasn't a mess of angry red splatters. It was yellow and bright and hopeful. Julian watched as Ava looked up at Simone. The little girl smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was the first time Julian had seen it since his wife died. Simone smiled back and tucked a loose curl behind Ava's ear. The gesture was so tender, so maternal, that it made Julian's chest ache with a sudden sharp longing. He reached out. His fingers traced the image of his daughter on the cold LED screen. He realized with a jolt that he had forgotten what peace looked like. He had been so convinced by Vanessa that his children were broken that he had stopped looking for the light inside them. But Simone had found it in less than 24 hours. A spark of hope ignited in his chest, fragile but undeniable. Maybe they weren't monsters. Maybe they were just lonely. The moment was shattered by the sharp buzz of the intercom. Julian pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "Yes," he answered, his voice rough with emotion. "Mr. Thorne." It was his personal assistant, Marcus. "I have the weekly financial reports you asked for. There is a flag on the joint household account." Julian frowned. The joint account was strictly for household maintenance and the children's expenses. He clicked open the file Marcus had sent. "What is it, Marcus?" "There was a withdrawal made 2 hours ago, sir. $50,000. It was authorized by Miss Sterling." Julian stared at the number. $50,000. Vanessa had her own black card. She had her own allowance. Why would she drain $50,000 from the household fund on a Tuesday afternoon? "Did she leave a memo for the expense?" Julian asked, his eyes narrowing. The assistant hesitated. "The memo says medical consultation, sir. For the children." Julian looked back at the camera feed. He saw his children calm and happy painting sunflowers with a woman who barely made minimum wage. He looked at the withdrawal slip for a medical consultation that never happened. A cold knot of suspicion began to form in his stomach, replacing the hope from seconds ago. Vanessa was up to something, and for the first time, Julian wasn't going to look the other way. The evening sun cast long shadows across the nursery floor, turning the chaotic room into something almost peaceful. It was time for the bedtime routine, a ritual that used to involve screaming and tears, but was now surprisingly quiet. Simone sat on the edge of the four-poster bed, with Mia sitting between her knees. Mia was the smallest of the quadruplets, the one who usually hid behind her brothers. She had hair like spun gold, tangled and neglected. Simone held a detangling brush in her hand, working through the knots with the kind of patience that only a mother or a seasoned nurse possesses. She hummed a low melody, a jazz tune from her childhood, trying to make the little girl relax. Mia's shoulders were stiff. She held her breath as if waiting for pain. "Relax, little one," Simone whispered, moving the brush down the length of the hair. "I am not going to pull, I promise." She reached a particularly stubborn knot near the base of Mia's neck just behind the left ear. Simone moved her hand to gently hold the hair in place so the brushing wouldn't hurt. Her thumb grazed the skin. Mia didn't just flinch. She jerked away violently, letting out a sharp gasp of pain that sounded like a wounded animal. She scrambled off the bed and backed into the corner, her hands flying up to cover the side of her head. Her eyes were wide with terror, staring at Simone, as if the brush were a knife. Simone froze. She knew that reaction. That wasn't the reaction of a tender-headed child. That was the reaction of a child who had been hurt. Simone placed the brush on the bedspread. She held her hands up, palms open, showing she had nothing to hide. "I am sorry," Simone said, her voice soft but commanding. "Come here, Mia. Let me see." Mia shook her head violently, tears welling up in her eyes. She pressed her hand harder against her ear, trying to hide whatever was there. Simone didn't move closer. She waited. "I am not mad," she said. "But I am a nurse, remember? I fix boo-boos. If you are hurt, you have to let me see it so I can make it better." Slowly, the fear in Mia's eyes gave way to something else. Exhaustion. The little girl stepped forward, trembling. She turned her head to the side and slowly lowered her hand. Simone leaned in. She gently parted the thick blonde hair behind Mia's ear. She expected to see a scratch, maybe a bug bite. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a bruise, but it wasn't a normal round bruise from a fall. It was a deep, angry purple mark, shaped like a perfect crescent moon. It was an indentation where something sharp and curved had dug into the soft flesh of the scalp with vicious force. It had broken the skin slightly, leaving a scab that was trying to heal. Simone stared at the mark. Her mind raced. She had seen injuries like this in the emergency room. This wasn't an accident. This was a pinch delivered with enough force to crush the capillaries. And then she saw the shape again. The curve. The sharp point at the end. A memory flashed in Simone's mind. She saw Vanessa standing in the kitchen that morning. She saw Vanessa's hand resting on the counter. She saw the manicure. Long acrylic nails painted a nude pink but filed to a deadly sharp point. And on the ring finger, a large diamond-encrusted decoration that stuck out. Simone looked closely at the bruise again. There was a second smaller mark right next to the crescent. A scratch that matched the placement of a diamond. The realization hit Simone like a physical blow. This wasn't random violence, this was calculated. Vanessa wasn't just verbally abusive, she was physically hurting them in places where the hair would cover the evidence. She was digging her claws into them whenever they disobeyed, whenever Julian wasn't looking. Simone gently let the hair fall back into place, covering the mark. She didn't gasp. She didn't cry. A cold, deadly calm settled over her. She looked at Mia, who was watching her with terrified eyes, waiting for the secret to be out. Simone cupped Mia's face in her hands. Her thumbs wiped away the tears. "Did the lady with the sharp nails do this?" Simone asked quietly. Mia didn't speak. She just blinked, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. She nodded. Simone pulled Mia into a hug, burying the girl's face in her shoulder, so Mia wouldn't see the murderous rage in Simone's eyes. She looked at the camera in the corner of the room. She knew Julian wasn't watching right now, but she hoped he would watch later. Because the war had just changed. It wasn't just about saving these children anymore. It was about destroying the monster who was hurting them. The peace in the house was short-lived. It was shattered the next morning by a shriek that echoed from the master suite all the way down to the kitchen. Vanessa came running down the stairs, her face a portrait of hysterical grief. "My ring," she screamed, clutching her left hand. "My engagement ring. It is gone." Julian, who was drinking coffee at the table, stood up immediately. He caught her by the shoulders. Calm down, Vanessa. Where did you leave it? On the vanity, she sobbed. I took it off to shower. And when I came out, it was gone. The only person who has been upstairs this morning is her. She pointed a shaking finger at Simone, who was calmly washing dishes at the sink. Simone turned off the water. She dried her hands on a towel and turned around. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had been expecting this. I haven't been in your room, Simone said quietly. I have been in the kitchen since 6 a.m. making breakfast. Liar, Vanessa spat. You are a thief. That ring is worth $500,000. I want her searched, Julian. I want the police. Julian looked at Simone. There was conflict in his eyes. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence of a missing ring was serious. He didn't have to call the police. They were already at the gate. Vanessa had called them before she even came downstairs. 2 officers walked in. They didn't ask questions. They went straight to Simone. Empty your pockets, ma'am, the officer said, his hand near his holster. Simone didn't argue. She reached into the front pocket of her apron. Her hand brushed against something cold and hard. She froze. She knew instantly what it was. She pulled it out. The diamond ring glittered in the kitchen light. Vanessa gasped theatrically. I knew it. I knew she was a criminal. She stole it right off my dresser. Julian stared at the ring in Simone's hand. His face fell. The hope he had started to feel, the trust he was building, it all crumbled in that second. Simone? He said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Why? Officer, arrest her, Vanessa demanded. Take her away now. The officer stepped forward, grabbing Simone's wrist. You have the right to remain silent. Wait. Simone didn't pull away. She didn't look at the officer. She looked straight at Julian. Her eyes were not the eyes of a guilty woman. They were burning with a fierce intelligence. Before you put those cuffs on me, Mr. Thorne, Simone said, her voice steady as a rock, I want you to check the security footage. We have the evidence right here, the officer said, tightening his grip. Check the footage, Simone repeated louder. Hallway camera B4. Timestamp 8:05 a.m. this morning. Vanessa froze. Her eyes darted nervously to Julian. We don't need cameras, Julian. We caught her red-handed. Julian looked at Vanessa's panic. Then he looked at Simone's calm. Wait a minute, officer, Julian said. He pulled out his phone and opened the security app. He scrolled back to 8:05 a.m. The video played on the small screen. It showed the hallway outside the kitchen. Simone's apron was hanging on a hook by the door. The hallway was empty. Then Vanessa walked into the frame. She looked around to make sure no one was watching. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the ring, and dropped it into the pocket of Simone's apron. Then she smiled and walked away. The kitchen went dead silent. Julian looked up from the phone. His face wasn't disappointed anymore. It was terrifying. He turned the screen around so Vanessa could see it. Care to explain this? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Vanessa's face went pale. I was just testing her. It was a loyalty test, Julian. Get out, Julian said. But Julian, get out of my kitchen. Vanessa fled the room, but not before shooting a look of pure hatred at Simone. The officer released Simone's wrist, looking awkward. I apologize, ma'am, the officer mumbled. Simone didn't answer him. She picked up the sponge and turned back to the sink. She knew she had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The handcuffs were inches from Simone's wrists when Julian spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension in the kitchen like a knife. Wait! The officer paused, holding the metal cuffs in mid-air. Julian did not look at him. He was staring at his phone screen, his thumb swiping across the glass with a terrifying precision. He was accessing the cloud server for the house security system. He tapped the screen once, then twice. Everyone in the room held their breath. Vanessa stood near the refrigerator, her arms crossed, trying to look righteous, but there was a tremor in her hands that she could not hide. Julian turned the volume up. The timestamp on the screen read 8:05 in the morning. On the small glowing screen, the truth played out in high definition, black and white. The hallway outside the kitchen was empty. Then Vanessa walked into the frame. She was wearing her silk robe holding a cup of coffee. She stopped. She looked left toward the stairs. She looked right toward the living room. It was the look of a thief checking for witnesses. Then with a quick practiced movement, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the diamond ring. She stepped toward the coat rack where Simone's gray apron was hanging. She dropped the ring into the front pocket, patted it down to make sure it was hidden, and then walked away with a smile on her face. The video ended. Julian slowly lifted his head. He turned the phone around so everyone could see the frozen image of Vanessa planting the evidence. "Care to explain this?" he asked. His voice was dangerously low. The silence that followed was suffocating. The police officer looked at the phone, then at Vanessa. He slowly lowered the handcuffs and took a step back from Simone. Vanessa's face went from pale to a flushed crimson. She realized she was cornered. But instead of apologizing, she did what she always did. She played the victim. Tears instantly welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in a perfect performance of distress. "It was a test," she sobbed. Her voice pitched high and desperate. "I was only testing her loyalty, Julian. You know how hard it is to find good help. You know you cannot trust people like her around our things. I had to be sure. I did it for us, Julian. I did it to protect our family." She reached out to grab Julian's hand, but he pulled away as if her touch burned him. "You tried to send an innocent woman to jail," Julian said. "That is not a test, Vanessa. That is a crime." He looked at the police officers. "You can go. There has been a mistake. And it wasn't made by Miss Davis." The officers nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic drama, and shuffled out of the kitchen, leaving the three of them alone in the wreckage of the morning. Vanessa wiped her eyes, her mascara smearing. She looked at Julian, expecting him to soften. She expected him to forgive her like he always did. Julian heaved a sigh that seemed to rattle his entire chest. He looked at Simone, who had returned to the sink, her back straight, her dignity untouched. Then he looked at Vanessa. For the first time since they met, he didn't see the perfect fiancée. He saw a stranger. He saw a liar. "Get out of the kitchen," Julian said. Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. "I said get out." She fled the room, the sound of her sobbing fading as she ran up the stairs. Julian stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. The blindfold was starting to slip. He was beginning to see the cracks in his perfect life, and for the first time, he wondered what other lies Vanessa had told him about his children. The house was silent, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, artificial silence of a graveyard. It was 2 in the morning. Simone Davis stood in the shadows of the kitchen hallway, listening. She waited until she heard the soft, rhythmic snoring of the security guard down the hall. She waited until the house settled into its deepest sleep. Then she moved. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't need them. She knew the layout of this kitchen better than she knew her own apartment. She moved across the marble floor in her socks, silent as a ghost. She reached the high cabinet above the espresso machine. This was Vanessa's territory. This was where the supplements were kept. Simone opened the cabinet door. The hinges were well oiled and made no sound. There it was, sitting right in front, a large plastic bottle with a bright yellow label, Superstar Kids Multivitamins. It featured cartoon bears dancing under a rainbow. It looked innocent. It looked like something a loving mother would buy to keep her children healthy. Simone grabbed the bottle. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from rage. She had watched Vanessa feed these to the children every single night. She had watched Vanessa insist they finish every bite, saying it was for their bones, for their growth. But Simone had seen the look in the children's eyes 20 minutes after eating them. It wasn't sleepiness. It was a shutdown, a complete system collapse. She unscrewed the cap. The smell hit her instantly. It was sweet, sickeningly sweet like artificial grape designed to mask something bitter. She tipped the bottle and shook 3 gummy bears into a small Ziploc bag she had brought from her room. She quickly screwed the cap back on and placed the bottle exactly where she found it, turning the label to the same angle so Vanessa wouldn't suspect a thing. She didn't go back to bed. She went to the service entrance. She slipped out into the cool night air. A dark sedan was idling just outside the gate. It was Darius, an old friend from her days in the trauma unit. He now ran the night shift at a private toxicology lab. He owed her a favor for saving his license 3 years ago. Simone passed the bag through the gate bars. "Run a full spectrum," she whispered. "Don't look for vitamins. Look for everything else." Darius nodded, took the bag and drove off into the darkness. The next 4 hours were the longest of Simone's life. She sat in the rocking chair in the nursery watching the 4 children sleep. They didn't move. They didn't dream. They lay there like dolls, their breathing too shallow, their skin too pale. At 6 in the morning, her phone buzzed in her lap. She grabbed it, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was a text from Darius. There were no pleasantries, no hello, just a screenshot of a chemical analysis and 3 lines of text that made Simone's blood freeze in her veins. "Get those kids out of there, Simone. This isn't a vitamin. It is haloperidol, a heavy-duty antipsychotic used for schizophrenia in adults. The dosage is high enough to knock out a horse. Who is feeding this to children?" Simone dropped the phone on the carpet. She stared at the sleeping children. It wasn't bad genetics. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't madness. They were being chemically lobotomized every single night to keep them quiet so a woman could steal their inheritance. Simone stood up. She picked up the phone. Her hands were no longer shaking. She walked over to the window and looked out at the sunrise. The time for hiding was over. She had the weapon she needed, and she was going to use it to burn Vanessa's world to the ground. The grand staircase of the Thorne estate was an architectural masterpiece of marble and mahogany, but it had one flaw. There was a blind spot on the landing between the first and second floors. It was the only place in the house where the security cameras could not see. It was a shadow in a house made of glass. Simone Davis knew this. She had studied the security feeds for 3 days, waiting for this exact moment. It was mid-morning. The house was quiet. Vanessa Sterling was descending the stairs, dressed in a white cashmere suit that cost more than Simone's entire education. She was humming to herself, clicking her phone screen, probably ordering another shipment of poison or planning her next charity gala. She looked untouchable. She looked like the queen of the castle. But when she turned the corner on the landing, she stopped dead. Simone was standing there. She wasn't holding a mop. She wasn't holding a broom. She was standing with her arms crossed, leaning against the railing blocking the path. "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with irritation. "You are in my way. Move." Simone didn't move. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small plastic Ziploc bag. Inside sat 3 innocent-looking gummy bears. Vanessa's eyes flickered to the bag, then back to Simone's face. The humming stopped. The irritation was replaced by a sharp, cold alertness. "I know what you are doing," Simone said. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a judge reading a sentence. "I sent these to a lab." Vanessa laughed, a short, nervous sound. "You are pathetic. They are vitamins. They are haloperidol." Simone cut her off. "A heavy-duty antipsychotic. You are drugging 7-year-old children. You are forcing their brains to shut down so they act out, so they scream, so they look like monsters. You want them to fail. You want Julian to send them away so you can have this house and his money all to yourself." The accusation hung in the air between them. For a second, Simone thought Vanessa might deny it. She thought the woman might play the victim again, scream for help, or claim she was being framed. But Vanessa did something far more terrifying. She looked up at the ceiling, checking the camera angle. She saw the blind spot. She realized they were invisible. And then she smiled. It was a smile devoid of humanity. It was the smile of a predator who knows the trap is already sprung. She took a step closer to Simone, invading her personal space, until she could smell the cheap soap on Simone's uniform. "You are a smart girl," Vanessa whispered, her voice silky and cruel. "Smarter than the others. But you are making one fatal calculation error." "I am going to tell him," Simone said, gripping the railing. "I am going to show him the report." "Go ahead," Vanessa challenged, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Show him. Show. Tell him. Scream it from the rooftop. But ask yourself this, Simone. Who do you think he will believe?" Vanessa reached out and flicked the collar of Simone's gray uniform. "I am his fiancée. I am the woman who shares his bed. I am the daughter of a senator. I belong in this world. And you? Look at you. You are a black maid from the projects with a criminal record and a chip on her shoulder. To him you are replaceable. To him you are invisible." Simone felt a cold knot of rage tighten in her stomach. "He is a good man," Simone said. "He loves his children. He loves the idea of a perfect family," Vanessa corrected. "And I am the one who gives him that image. You are just the help. You are a temporary inconvenience. If you try to expose me, I will twist the story so fast your head will spin. I will tell him you planted the drugs. I will tell him you are the one abusing them. And he will believe me. Because people like him always believe people like me." Vanessa brushed past Simone, bumping her shoulder hard. She walked down the rest of the stairs, her heels clicking a rhythm of absolute victory. Simone stood alone in the shadow. She squeezed the bag of pills in her hand until her knuckles turned white. Vanessa was right about the power dynamic. She was right about the unfairness of the world. But she was wrong about one thing. She thought Simone was fighting alone. She didn't know that the army Simone was building upstairs was finally ready to fight back. Vanessa Sterling did not continue down the stairs. She stopped just a few feet away from the blind spot where Simone was standing. She turned her back to the camera that monitored the lower hallway. She looked at the heavy mahogany doorframe of the guest suite. It was solid wood with a sharp carved edge. Vanessa took a deep breath. She didn't look scared. She looked like an actress preparing for a scene. She closed her eyes and slammed her forehead violently against the wood. The sound was a sickening thud of bone hitting timber. Simone gasped, stepping forward instinctively as a nurse. But Vanessa wasn't done. Blood began to trickle down her forehead, staining her pale skin. She reached up with her manicured claws and ripped the collar of her expensive white silk blouse, exposing her shoulder. She clawed at her own neck, leaving angry red welts that looked exactly like defensive wounds. She messed up her perfect hair until she looked like she had been dragged through a fight. Then she opened her mouth and let out a scream that curdled the blood. "Help me! She is killing me! Julian, help!" She didn't wait for Simone to react. Vanessa threw herself down the remaining stairs, stumbling and sobbing loud enough to wake the dead. She collapsed in the center of the foyer, right under the main crystal chandelier, where the light would catch every drop of blood on her face. Julian burst out of his office. His face was white with panic. He saw his fiancée lying on the marble floor, a crumpled heap of white silk and red blood. "Vanessa." He slid across the floor, falling to his knees beside her. He gathered her into his arms. Her blood smeared onto his crisp dress shirt. "She attacked me, Julian," Vanessa sobbed, clinging to him, her fingernails digging into his back. "She is crazy. I caught her trying to steal again and she just snapped. She hit me. She tried to strangle me. Look at what she did." Vanessa tilted her head back, exposing the scratches on her neck and the gash on her forehead. Julian looked at the wounds. They were real. The blood was warm. The terror in Vanessa's voice sounded absolute. Simone stood at the top of the stairs. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the small Ziploc bag of pills in her hand. But from where Julian sat, it didn't look like evidence. It looked like she was just standing there watching her handiwork with a cold, detached stare. Julian looked up. His eyes met Simone's. 5 minutes ago, he had been ready to believe her. He had been ready to trust her with his children's lives. But now he was holding the woman he was supposed to marry, and she was bleeding. The image of the perfect family was shattered by violence. "Simone!" Julian said, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and confusion. "What did you do?" Simone didn't shout. She didn't run down to defend herself. She saw the trap. It was perfect. Anything she said now would sound like the lies of a guilty woman. She tightened her grip on the bag of haloperidol. She realized with a sinking heart that the truth didn't matter when the lie was written in blood. "I didn't touch her," Simone said quietly. Julian looked down at Vanessa, who was weeping into his chest, then back at Simone. The trust in his eyes fractured. He didn't see the savior anymore. He saw what Vanessa wanted him to see: a threat, a stranger, a danger to his home. And for the first time, Simone felt a flicker of real fear. Not for herself, but for the children who were now left alone with a woman willing to bash her own head in just to win a game. Vanessa Sterling did not continue down the stairs. She stopped just a few feet away from the blind spot where Simone was standing. She turned her back to the camera that monitored the lower hallway. She looked at the heavy mahogany doorframe of the guest suite. It was solid wood with a sharp carved edge. Vanessa took a deep breath. She didn't look scared. She looked like an actress preparing for a scene. She closed her eyes and slammed her forehead violently against the wood. The sound was a sickening thud of bone hitting timber. Simone gasped, stepping forward instinctively as a nurse. But Vanessa wasn't done. Blood began to trickle down her forehead, staining her pale skin. She reached up with her manicured claws and ripped the collar of her expensive white silk blouse, exposing her shoulder. She clawed at her own neck, leaving angry red welts that looked exactly like defensive wounds. She messed up her perfect hair until she looked like she had been dragged through a fight. Then she opened her mouth and let out a scream that curdled the blood. "Help me! She is killing me! Julian, help!" She didn't wait for Simone to react. Vanessa threw herself down the remaining stairs, stumbling and sobbing loud enough to wake the dead. She collapsed in the center of the foyer, right under the main crystal chandelier, where the light would catch every drop of blood on her face. Julian burst out of his office. His face was white with panic. He saw his fiancée lying on the marble floor, a crumpled heap of white silk and red blood. Vanessa. He slid across the floor, falling to his knees beside her. He gathered her into his arms. Her blood smeared onto his crisp dress shirt. "She attacked me, Julian," Vanessa sobbed, clinging to him, her fingernails digging into his back. "She is crazy. I caught her trying to steal again and she just snapped. She hit me. She tried to strangle me. Look at what she did." Vanessa tilted her head back, exposing the scratches on her neck and the gash on her forehead. Julian looked at the wounds. They were real. The blood was warm. The terror in Vanessa's voice sounded absolute. Simone stood at the top of the stairs. She hadn't moved. She was still holding the small Ziploc bag of pills in her hand. But from where Julian sat, it didn't look like evidence. It looked like she was just standing there watching her handiwork with a cold, detached stare. Julian looked up. His eyes met Simone's. 5 minutes ago, he had been ready to believe her. He had been ready to trust her with his children's lives. But now he was holding the woman he was supposed to marry, and she was bleeding. The image of the perfect family was shattered by violence. "Simone," Julian said, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and confusion. "What did you do?" Simone didn't shout. She didn't run down to defend herself. She saw the trap. It was perfect. Anything she said now would sound like the lies of a guilty woman. She tightened her grip on the bag of haloperidol. She realized with a sinking heart that the truth didn't matter when the lie was written in blood. "I didn't touch her," Simone said quietly. Julian looked down at Vanessa, who was weeping into his chest, then back at Simone. The trust in his eyes fractured. He didn't see the savior anymore. He saw what Vanessa wanted him to see: a threat, a stranger, a danger to his home. And for the first time, Simone felt a flicker of real fear, not for herself, but for the children who were now left alone with a woman willing to bash her own head in just to win a game. The library was usually a place of sanctuary for Julian Thorne, but tonight it felt like a courtroom. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his hand resting on a thick manila folder that had just been placed there by Vanessa's personal attorney. Vanessa sat on the leather sofa dabbing at her bandaged forehead with a tissue. She looked fragile. She looked broken. The attorney, Mr. Blackwood, adjusted his glasses. "We ran a deeper background check on Miss Davis," he said, his voice dry and professional. "It seems the agency missed a few critical details regarding why she lost her nursing license." Julian opened the folder. He expected to see a negligence charge, maybe a medication error, but the words on the page made his stomach turn over. License revoked. Cause for termination. Physical assault of a pediatric patient. Julian read the line twice. Then he read it a third time, hoping the words would change. They didn't. The report was on official hospital letterhead. It had stamps. It had signatures. To a man like Julian, who lived his life by contracts and data, this was not just an accusation. It was a fact. He looked up at Simone. She was standing near the door, flanked by 2 security guards. She stood tall, but Julian could see the tension in her jaw. "Is this true?" Julian asked. The paper shook slightly in his hand. "Did you hurt a child?" Simone took a step forward. "It is a forgery, Mr. Thorne. I was fired because I reported the chief surgeon for malpractice. He falsified the records to discredit me. That is what powerful men do when they get caught." Mr. Blackwood chuckled softly. "A forgery on state board letterhead. That is a serious accusation, Miss Davis. Do you have proof?" "I have my word," Simone said. Julian looked at the document again. It looked perfect. Then he looked at Vanessa, who was weeping softly into her hands, the blood from her injury still fresh on her skin. He looked at Simone, who had no proof, only her word. His gut told him Simone was good. His heart remembered how she saved Liam, but his mind, his logical business mind, could not ignore the evidence in front of him. A woman who had assaulted a patient in the past was now accused of assaulting his fiancée in the present. The pattern was too clear to ignore. Julian closed the folder. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He didn't scream. He didn't throw her out. He went cold. It was the terrifying shutdown of a man who felt he had been played for a fool. "You are suspended," Julian said. Simone's eyes widened. "Mr. Thorne, please. If you send me away, she will hurt them again." "Enough," Julian snapped, slamming his hand on the desk. "I am not firing you yet. I will have my own team investigate this document, but until then you are a liability." He stood up and walked to the window, refusing to look at her. "You are confined to your quarters, effective immediately. You do not step foot in the nursery. You do not speak to my children. You do not leave your room. If you violate these orders, I will have you arrested for trespassing." "But the medication," Simone pleaded. "They need to be weaned off the poison." "Security, get her out of here," Julian ordered, his back turned. The guards grabbed Simone's arms. She didn't fight them this time. She looked at Julian's back, at the wall he had built around himself. She realized that Vanessa hadn't just faked a document. She had weaponized Julian's own fear against him. Simone let them lead her away. As the heavy library doors closed, she saw Vanessa lower the tissue from her face. There were no tears in her eyes, just a cold, victorious smile that promised the nightmare was only just beginning. The mansion did not look like a home that night. It looked like a stage set for a play about happiness that nobody actually felt. The great hall was transformed into a glittering ballroom filled with white roses, imported from France, and towers of champagne that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers. Outside the iron gates, a line of black limousines stretched down the block, carrying the elite of New York society. They were coming to see the perfect family. They were coming to see the billionaire and his beautiful fiancée, and his 4 adorable children. They did not know they were walking into a crime scene. Upstairs in the nursery, the atmosphere was suffocating. Vanessa Sterling stood in front of the floor-length mirror, adjusting a diamond necklace that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Behind her, the four children stood in a rigid line. They were not dressed for comfort, they were dressed for display. Liam pulled at the collar of his velvet tuxedo. It was 2 sizes too small, cutting into his neck every time he swallowed. Noah tried to scratch his arm, but the jacket was so tight his movements were restricted like a straitjacket. Mia stood frozen, afraid to move and wrinkle the silk dress that scratched her skin. "Stop fidgeting," Vanessa snapped. She did not turn around. She watched them through the reflection in the glass. "You are not children tonight. You are props. If you ruin my image, if you embarrass me in front of the board members, I will make sure you spend the rest of the year in the dark." She turned her gaze to Ava. Ava was the wild one, the one who had the most fight left in her eyes. Tonight, Vanessa needed that fight extinguished. She needed chaos, but she needed it to look like madness, not rebellion. Vanessa walked over to the dresser. She picked up the bottle of gummy bears. Usually she gave them one a dose strong enough to make them drowsy. But tonight was special. Tonight she needed a show. She shook 2 red bears into her palm. Then she paused and added a third. "Eat!" Vanessa commanded, holding her hand out to Ava. Ava shook her head. Her eyes darted to the door, looking for the one person who ever protected her. She was looking for Simone. "She is not coming to save you," Vanessa whispered, her voice low and venomous. "She is locked away where trash belongs. Now eat, or I will put you in the cellar." She forced the gummies into Ava's mouth, holding the little girl's jaw shut until she swallowed. The chemical hit the child's small system with terrifying speed. 10 minutes later, the fight in Ava's eyes began to dissolve. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were black pools of terror. She started blinking rapidly as if trying to clear a fog. She looked at the corner of the room where a shadow was cast by the wardrobe. To anyone else, it was just a shadow. To Ava's drugged brain, it began to move. It grew claws. It grew teeth. She whimpered, pawing at the air, trying to push away invisible monsters. She stumbled her legs, feeling like jelly, and bumped into the wall. Vanessa watched her stumble. She didn't help. She smiled, a cold, satisfied smile. "Perfect," she muttered. "Just crazy enough for the audience." 3 floors down in the cramped staff quarters, Simone Davis threw her shoulder against the door. It was solid oak and locked from the outside. She had been down here for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the orchestra starting up. She grabbed a heavy metal chair and slammed it against the lock with all her strength. The noise rang out, but nobody came. The music was too loud. The party was too big. Simone dropped the chair and pressed her ear to the wood. She felt a sick feeling in her gut, the kind of instinct that had never failed her in the emergency room. She knew something terrible was happening upstairs. She wasn't just fighting for her job anymore. She was fighting to get out before Vanessa turned those children into a tragedy for the evening news. Simone grit her teeth, stepped back, and prepared to throw her body against the door one more time. She was going to break her shoulder or break the door, but she was not going to stay in this room. The string quartet was playing Mozart, a soft, elegant sound that drifted over the manicured lawn of the Thorne estate. The air smelled of expensive perfume and old money. Julian stood at the center of the patio, holding a glass of champagne, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the stem. He watched his 4 children walk out in a line like trained soldiers. They looked beautiful in their velvet suits and silk dresses, but anyone looking closely could see the glaze over their eyes. Especially Ava. The medication Vanessa had forced down her throat was peaking. The lights of the pool were too bright. They blurred and stretched like neon taffy. Ava looked at the crowd. She didn't see smiling faces. She saw distorted masks. Then she saw Mrs. Cortland, the mayor's wife. The woman was wearing a large feathered hat and a shimmering silver dress. To Ava's drugged brain, the feathers turned into giant black wings. The silver dress turned into scales. The woman wasn't smiling, she was baring her teeth, ready to bite. Ava screamed. It wasn't a child's tantrum. It was a scream of pure primal terror that cut through the music like a knife. "Get away!" she shrieked, her voice breaking. "Get away from me, you monster!" She lunged forward. She didn't mean to hurt anyone, she just wanted to push the beast away before it ate her. Her small hands hit Mrs. Cortland's waist with surprising force. The woman stumbled back. Her high heels slipped on the wet tile. With a massive splash that silenced the entire orchestra, the mayor's wife fell backward into the illuminated swimming pool. The water turned blue then white with foam. Mrs. Cortland surfaced sputtering and gasping, her feathers ruined her dignity. Destroyed. The silence lasted exactly one heartbeat before the chaos erupted. Camera flashes went off like lightning, blinding everyone. The press, who had been invited to document the perfect family, were now documenting a disaster. The guests gasped, clutching their pearls and whispering behind their hands. Julian dropped his glass. It shattered on the stone. He stared in horror as his daughter stood by the edge of the pool, trembling and swatting at the air, fighting ghosts that only she could see. This was the moment Vanessa had been waiting for. She didn't run to help the drowning woman. She ran to Ava. She grabbed the little girl by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "What is wrong with you?" she screamed loud enough for the reporters to hear. "Look what you did! You are out of control!" Then she raised her hand. The slap echoed across the patio. It was sharp and cruel. Ava stumbled back, clutching her cheek, stunned into silence. Her hallucination shattered by the physical pain. Julian stepped forward to stop her, but he was too late. In the confusion, as Vanessa pulled Ava into a rough embrace, pretending to comfort her, she made her move. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her own dress and pulled out a small object. It was a crude doll made of burlap, stuck with black pins. With a sleight of hand that would make a magician jealous, she shoved the doll deep into the pocket of Ava's silk dress. She looked up at Julian, her eyes wide with fake tears. "She is sick, Julian," she cried, holding the trembling child tight so she couldn't speak. "She is completely gone. We have to do something before she kills someone." The splash from the pool had barely settled when Vanessa made her next move. The crowd was still gasping, staring at the mayor's wife, who was being fished out of the water like a drowned rat. But Vanessa Sterling knew that shock was a temporary currency. She needed something stronger. She needed horror. She knelt on the wet stone patio, holding the trembling Ava by the arms. She didn't hug the child. She gripped her like a police officer restraining a suspect. "What do you have in your pocket?" Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill enough to cut through the murmur of the crowd. "What are you hiding?" Ava was too drugged to answer. Her eyes were rolling back in her head, her small hands swatting at invisible flies. Vanessa didn't wait. She jammed her hand into the pocket of Ava's ruined silk dress. She rummaged for a second, making sure everyone was watching. Then she jerked her hand back as if she had been bitten. With a theatrical gasp, she pulled out the object she had planted there only moments ago. The flashbulbs popped, illuminating the item in her hand with a stark, unforgiving light. It was not a Barbie. It was not a teddy bear. It was a crude doll made of rough burlap sacking, twisted and bound with black thread. But it was the details that made the wealthy guests recoil in collective disgust. 3 long, rusty needles were jammed deep into the doll's head and chest, and the fabric was stained with a dark, crusty substance that looked undeniably like dried blood. "Oh my God," Vanessa shrieked, dropping the doll onto the pristine white tiles as if it were radioactive. "It is witchcraft. It is black magic." The crowd went silent. The music stopped completely. In the world of the Hamptons, violence was tolerated if it was polite, but this was something primal, something foreign. Vanessa looked up at Julian, tears streaming down her face. She pointed a shaking finger at the doll. "I told you, Julian. I told you she was dangerous. That woman, Simone, she hasn't been teaching them art. She has been teaching them this." She turned to the crowd, playing to their deepest, ugliest fears. "I found feathers in her room." Vanessa lied, her voice breaking with emotion. "I found bones. I tried to warn Julian, but he wouldn't listen. She has been brainwashing my innocent children. She told Ava that this doll would make the monsters go away. Look what she has done to them." The accusation hung in the humid air. It was a spark that landed on dry tinder. The guests were the elite of New York. They were wealthy, powerful, and predominantly white. As they looked at the crude doll, and then heard the name of the Black Maid, a shift occurred in the atmosphere. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was revulsion. They turned their eyes toward the house. They looked past the grand ballroom, past the champagne towers, and focused their gaze on the darkened windows of the staff quarters. Their expressions were filled with a cold, haughty disgust. They didn't see a woman who had been framed. They saw a stereotype. They saw a threat to their civilized world. They saw a savage who had infiltrated their sanctuary. Julian stood frozen, staring at the doll on the ground. He looked at his daughter, who was rocking back and forth, muttering nonsense. The logic in his brain was screaming that this was impossible, but the evidence was staring him in the face. Vanessa's performance was flawless. She had turned his home into a stage and Simone into the villain. And as the whispers of the crowd turned into a roar of condemnation, Julian felt the last shred of his resistance crumble. The music from the gala faded as Julian Thorne stormed down the narrow concrete hallway of the service wing. The air down here was cold and smelled of damp earth, a stark contrast to the perfume and champagne upstairs. But Julian didn't notice the cold. His blood was boiling so hot, he felt like he was burning alive from the inside out. In his right hand, he gripped the burlap doll so tightly that the rusty needles dug into his own palm, drawing blood. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that was currently tearing his chest apart. He reached the door to the staff room. He didn't reach for a key. He didn't knock. He channeled every ounce of his rage and shame into one violent motion. He lifted his heavy dress shoe and kicked the door right next to the lock. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. The door flew open, banging against the interior wall. Simone Davis jumped up from the cot where she had been sitting. She looked ready to fight, ready to run, but when she saw Julian, she froze. She saw a man who had completely unraveled. His tie was undone, his hair was wild, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying mix of sorrow and fury. Julian didn't speak. He stepped into the small room and hurled the object in his hand. The burlap doll flew through the air. It struck Simone square in the chest with a soft thud and fell to the floor between them. The needles glinted in the harsh light of the naked bulb overhead. "I trusted you," Julian roared. His voice broke, cracking under the weight of his emotion. "I let you in. I let you hold my son when he was dying. I gave you access to the most precious thing in my life, and this is how you repay me. By teaching them black magic. By turning my daughter into a spectacle for the tabloids." Simone looked down at the doll, then up at him. She didn't flinch away from his anger. She stepped toward him. "It is not magic, Julian. Listen to me. Look at Ava's eyes. Did you see her pupils? That is not a spell. That is an overdose. Vanessa fed her the pills before the party. She planted this doll to frame me." "Stop it!" Julian screamed, slamming his hand against the wall. "Just stop lying. I saw the police report, Simone. I saw what you did to those patients in the past, and now you are doing it to mine. You manipulated them. You made them think they were sick so you could be their savior." He grabbed his own hair, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "Do you know what they are saying upstairs? Do you know what the world is going to say tomorrow? They are going to say the Thorne children are insane. They are going to say they are dangerous. You didn't just ruin a party, Simone. You destroyed their future." "It wasn't me," Simone pleaded, her voice desperate. "Check the toxicology report. Check the bottle in the kitchen." "I burned the report," Julian spat. "I am done looking at fake evidence. I am done listening to a woman who uses voodoo dolls to terrorize little girls." He stopped pacing. He looked at Simone with a look that was worse than hatred. It was disappointment, absolute crushing disappointment. "You broke them," Julian whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelids. "They were getting better. For a moment I thought they were getting better. But it was all a trick. You made them into monsters just to keep your job." He turned his back on her, unable to look at her face anymore. "Pack your things. The police are waiting at the gate. If you are not gone in 10 minutes, I will let them come in here and drag you out. And this time I won't stop them." Two heavy hands clamped onto Simone's shoulders like iron vices. The security guards didn't ask her to leave. They dragged her. One of them twisted her arm behind her back with enough force to make a grown man cry out. But Simone bit her lip until it bled, refusing to give Vanessa the satisfaction of a scream. "Get her off the property!" Julian shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "If she resists, call the police. I want her gone." The guests parted like the Red Sea, watching the spectacle with a mix of horror and fascination. They clutched their champagne flutes, whispering behind their hands, their eyes judging the woman in the gray uniform who was being hauled away like a common criminal. Julian turned to face them. He looked wrecked. His tie was crooked, his face flushed with shame. He felt the weight of every stare, and he knew he had to do something to salvage the reputation of the Thorne name. He had to show them he was still in control, even though his world was burning down. "I apologize to everyone," Julian announced, his voice booming through the silence. "I tried to care for my children at home. I thought love would be enough. But it is clear now that their condition is beyond my ability to manage." He took a ragged breath. He felt Vanessa step up behind him. She placed a hand on his back, rubbing small, soothing circles between his shoulder blades. Her touch felt grounding. He leaned into it, unaware that it was the touch of the scorpion that had stung him. Tomorrow morning, Julian continued, his voice hardening with resolve. "My children will be transferred to Ironwood Academy. They need professional containment. It is the only way to ensure their safety and the safety of this community." A collective gasp went through the room. Ironwood was not a school. It was a prison for the broken children of the ultra-wealthy. It was a place where they broke spirits to build soldiers. Vanessa leaned in close to his ear. "You are doing the right thing, darling," she whispered. "It is hard, I know, but you are saving them. You are so brave." As she spoke, she looked up. Her eyes locked with Simone's across the room. The guards had paused at the door to adjust their grip. In that split second, the mask dropped. Vanessa didn't look sad. She didn't look concerned. Her lips curled up into a smile so sharp it could cut glass. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. She had won. The children were gone. The money was hers. And the only witness was being thrown into the street. Simone saw the smile. And in that moment, clarity hit her like a bucket of ice water. Fighting physically was useless. Screaming would only prove she was crazy. If she wanted to save those children, she had to stop playing Vanessa's game. She had to start playing her own. Simone stopped struggling. Her body went limp, not in surrender, but in calculation. The guard stumbled slightly at the sudden lack of resistance. "Walk," the guard grunted, shoving her forward. Simone straightened her spine. She didn't look back at Julian. She didn't look back at the smiling monster behind him. She walked through the door into the dark, rainy night with her head held high. She wasn't leaving in defeat. She was retreating to prepare the final strike. The security guards dragged Simone toward the heavy oak doors that led to the rainy night outside. Every step took her further away from the children who were now huddled together at the top of the grand staircase, watching their only protector being treated like a criminal. Julian Thorne stood with his back to her, refusing to watch the woman he thought had betrayed him. Vanessa stood beside him, her hand resting possessively on his arm, her face a mask of triumphant pity. "Wait," Simone said. She didn't shout this time. She spoke with a quiet intensity that made the guards pause. "Please, just let me say goodbye to them." Julian stiffened. He didn't turn around, but he gave a curt nod to the guards. "Let her have 1 minute, then get her out." The guards released her arms. Simone didn't run to all 4 of them. She knew that would cause a scene and Vanessa would intervene. Instead, she walked straight to Noah. He was the quiet one, the observer, the boy who spoke in Morse code and understood the hidden patterns of the world. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, separate from his siblings, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Simone knelt down in front of him. To the room full of guests, it looked like a disgraced nanny begging for forgiveness. To Vanessa, it looked like a pathetic display of sentiment. But to Simone and Noah, it was a briefing. Simone reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her hand closed around a small red plastic brick. It was a Lego piece, but it was not a toy. Inside the hollow plastic shell was a micro recorder and a wide-angle lens taken from a pen camera she had bought online weeks ago, anticipating this exact moment. It was a Trojan horse. She pulled Noah into a hug. As her arms went around him, she pressed the red brick into his small, sweaty palm. "Don't drop it," she whispered into his ear so low that only he could hear. Noah didn't flinch. He didn't look at the object. His fingers instinctively curled around the Lego, hiding it instantly. He was 7 years old, but in that moment he was a soldier accepting a mission. Simone pulled back slightly, just enough to look him in the eye. She didn't cry. She needed him to be strong. "Do you remember the game we practiced?" she whispered. "The Omega Protocol." Noah blinked once. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "Activated in 2 days," she instructed, her voice trembling with urgency. "Not tomorrow. 2 days. Wait until the house is quiet. Wait until Daddy is listening." Noah's eyes darted to his father, who was still staring at the floor, then back to Simone. He squeezed the Lego piece so hard his knuckles turned white. He understood. It wasn't just a toy. It was the weapon that would save them. "I promise," Simone whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I will come back for you. I will come back for all of you." "Time is up," the guard barked, grabbing Simone by the shoulder and hauling her to her feet. Simone didn't resist. She stepped back, her eyes locked on Noah. The little boy stood alone in the center of the foyer. He didn't cry. He didn't run after her. He slipped his hand into his pocket, securing the red brick that contained the truth. As the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing Simone out in the rain, Noah looked up at Vanessa. For the first time, he didn't look afraid. He looked like a boy who was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The heavy oak doors of the Thorne estate didn't just close. They slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid dropping. Simone stood on the front step for a fraction of a second, before the security guard gave her one final shove. She stumbled off the porch and onto the gravel driveway just as the sky opened up. The rain was not a drizzle. It was a freezing, torrential downpour that seemed to wash the very heat from the air. Within seconds, Simone's gray uniform was soaked through, sticking to her skin like a cold second skin. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. The water ran down her neck and into her shoes. She began to walk. The driveway was a mile long, lined with manicured hedges that looked like dark walls in the storm. Most people in her position would have been running. They would have been sobbing hysterically, broken by the humiliation of being branded a witch and thrown out into the night. They would be thinking about the injustice. They would be thinking about the cold. But Simone Davis was not most people. She did not run. She walked with a steady, rhythmic pace, her boots crunching on the wet gravel. She did not hug herself for warmth. She let her arms hang at her sides, her hands balled into fists, not of despair but of resolution. She stopped halfway down the drive and turned around. Through the sheets of rain, she could see the mansion glowing on the hill. It looked like a castle in a fairy tale, warm and golden and inviting. But Simone knew the truth. It was a house of horrors. She looked up at the third-floor window, the nursery. The light was off. She imagined Noah lying there in the dark, clutching the red Lego brick. She imagined Ava crying in her sleep, fighting off the drug-induced nightmares. A single drop of water rolled down Simone's cheek. It wasn't a tear. She refused to cry. Crying was for victims. Crying was for people who had given up, and she had not given up. She had just changed the battlefield. She reached the massive iron gates at the end of the property. The electronic lock beeped red, denying her re-entry. She was officially exiled. Simone reached into her soaked pocket and pulled out her phone. She shielded the screen from the rain with her hand. The light from the screen illuminated her face. Her eyes were hard and focused. She scrolled past the agency number. She scrolled past the police. She stopped on a name she hadn't called in years. Marcus. Channel 4 News. She pressed call. It rang once. Twice. Yeah, came a sleepy voice on the other end. Who is this? It is Simone, she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. Wake up, Marcus. Simone, I haven't heard from you since the hospital lawsuit. What time is it? It doesn't matter, Simone said, staring at the closed gates. Do you still have that slot for breaking news on the morning show? Yeah. Why? Clear your schedule, Simone commanded. Get a camera crew ready. I am coming to the studio. What do you have? Marcus asked, his voice suddenly alert. I have the story of the decade, Simone said. I have a billionaire, a corrupt politician's daughter, and 4 children being tortured in a golden cage. I am going to burn their reputation to the ground, Marcus. And I am going to give you the match. She hung up the phone without saying goodbye. She stepped through the pedestrian exit just as the automatic mechanism engaged. The massive iron gates swung shut with a final metallic clang that echoed in the night. It sounded like a prison door locking, but as Simone turned and walked into the darkness toward the main road, she knew the truth. Those gates weren't locking her out, they were locking Vanessa in. And tomorrow morning, when the sun came up and the cameras started rolling, those walls would not be high enough to hide the truth. The storm outside battered the stone walls of the Thorne estate with a fury that shook the window panes. But inside the nursery, the silence was absolute and terrifying. In the past, a night like this would have resulted in chaos. There would have been screaming tantrums, overturned furniture, and tears that lasted until dawn. Julian had always dreaded that noise. But tonight, as he stood outside the nursery door listening, he realized that the silence was infinitely worse. He opened the door a crack. The room was dark, lit only by the flash of lightning. The 4 children were not asleep. They were not crying. They were not hiding under their covers. Liam, Noah, Ava, and Mia sat on their respective beds. They were sitting cross-legged, their backs straight, their faces devoid of expression. They looked like 4 stone statues in a graveyard. They were staring straight ahead at the wall where Simone used to hang their artwork. Julian felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the drafty hallway. This was not the silence of peace. This was the silence of soldiers waiting in a bunker. He wanted to go in. He wanted to hug them, to tell them that Ironwood would fix everything, that they would be happy again. But looking at their blank, unblinking eyes, he felt a wall between them that was higher than the gates outside. They had shut him out. He had exiled the only person they loved, and in return they had exiled him from their hearts. Julian closed the door softly. He couldn't bear to look at them. He retreated to his study, the sanctuary where he hid from the world. He poured a glass of scotch, his hand shaking so much the bottle clinked against the crystal rim. He didn't bother with ice. He downed the amber liquid in one burning swallow and immediately poured another. He slumped into his leather chair, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. The house felt massive and empty. He had won, haven't he? He had protected his reputation. He had removed the threat. So why did he feel like he had just signed a deal with the devil? He thought of Simone standing in the rain. He thought of the way she looked at Noah. He thought of the burlap doll. It all seemed so clear an hour ago. But now, in the bottom of a whiskey glass, the edges of the truth were starting to blur. He needed comfort. He needed to be told he was a good father. Julian stood up, swaying slightly. He decided to go to Vanessa. She was the victim in all of this. She had been attacked. She had been terrified. Surely she was suffering just as much as he was. He walked down the long corridor toward the guest wing where Vanessa was staying until the wedding. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching long and distorted on the walls. He reached her door. He raised his hand to knock, expecting to hear soft weeping, or perhaps the silence of exhaustion. Instead, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was a giggle. It was a light, airy, carefree sound. The kind of laugh a woman makes when she is flirting at a cocktail party. Julian's hand hovered in the air. He leaned closer to the wood. "Oh, stop it, you are terrible!" Vanessa's voice drifted through the door. It was clear and bright, without a trace of the trauma she had displayed downstairs. No, it went perfectly. He believed every word. The little brat screamed right on cue. Julian stood paralyzed in the dark hallway. The whiskey turned sour in his stomach. He stared at the closed door, listening to the woman who claimed to be broken laughing as if she had just won the lottery. The silence of his children and the laughter of his fiancée collided in his mind, and for the first time, Julian Thorne was truly afraid. The morning sun rose over the estate, but it brought no warmth to the day. The sky was a sheet of flat, unmoving gray slate that seemed to press down on the roof of the mansion. At the bottom of the front steps, a vehicle was waiting. It was not a school bus. It was a black armored van with tinted windows so dark they looked like voids. On the side in discreet silver letters were the words, Ironwood Academy. It looked less like a place of learning and more like a transport for high-security prisoners. Two large men in uniform stood by the open back doors, waiting in silence. Julian Thorne stood on the gravel driveway. The cold wind bit through his coat, but he was numb to it. He felt like he was floating outside of his own body, watching a stranger make the worst mistake of his life. Vanessa stood beside him. She was dressed in a somber black suit, as if she were attending a funeral, but her eyes were bright and alert. In her hand she held a clipboard with a thick stack of legal documents. The paper fluttered slightly in the wind. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a heavy fountain pen. It was gold expensive and cold to the touch. She uncapped it with a sharp click that sounded like a trigger being pulled. "Here, darling," she said, her voice soft and cloying like poisoned honey. "It is just a formality. The headmaster needs these signed before they can transport the children. It is for their own safety." Julian looked at the pen. He looked at the documents. The words swam before his eyes. Temporary transfer of guardianship, medical power of attorney, involuntary commitment. These were not words a father should ever read, let alone sign. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to stop, to throw the pen away, to run upstairs and barricade the door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper. Vanessa stepped closer. She placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but her grip was firm. "Be strong, Julian," she whispered, leaning close so her perfume filled his nose, masking the smell of the exhaust. "Do it for them. Look at what happened last night. They are dangerous to themselves. If you love them, you have to let the professionals fix them." Julian closed his eyes. The image of the voodoo doll flashed in his mind. The image of Ava screaming at the gala. The image of Simone betraying him. The lies were a heavy weight that crushed his will. He took the pen. His hand was trembling so violently that the gold nib danced over the signature line. He took a ragged breath that rattled in his chest. He forced his hand to move. The tip of the pen scratched against the paper loud in the silence. He wrote his name. It felt less like a signature and more like he was carving out a piece of his own soul. He handed the clipboard back to Vanessa. She snatched it away quickly, checking the signature to make sure it was legally binding before sliding it into her bag with a satisfied snap. The deed was done. Julian stepped back, feeling lightheaded. He turned his head slowly, looking up at the second floor of the mansion. He looked at the large bay window of the nursery. Part of him hoped to see small faces pressed against the glass. Part of him hoped to see them waving or even crying. He wanted some sign that they knew he loved them, that they knew this was killing him. But the window was a blank staring eye. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, shutting out the world. There was no movement, no sign of life, just a wall of stone and glass that separated a father from the children he had just sold away. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked like a countdown to an execution. 60 minutes. That was all that remained before the armored van would start its engine and carry the Thorne legacy away to Ironwood. Julian walked down the corridor toward the nursery, his footsteps heavy and slow. He told himself he was going there to say goodbye. He told himself he wanted one last look at them before they were gone. But deep down, he was going there to punish himself. He wanted to see the ruin of his family one last time, to etch the failure into his memory so he would never forget it. He pushed the door open. The nursery was empty. The children were already downstairs being prepped by the staff. The room smelled of stale air and abandoned dreams. Julian stepped inside and looked around. His eyes stopped on the far wall. It was covered in paper. Hundreds of sheets of printer paper had been taped together, covering the expensive silk wallpaper from floor to ceiling. It looked like the work of madmen. It was a chaotic sea of black crayon lines, jagged scribbles, and dark shading. Julian felt a fresh wave of anger rise in his throat. This was Simone's doing. She had encouraged this. She had turned his home into an asylum before she even left. She had let them deface the walls with their insanity. He marched across the room, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to tear it all down. He wanted to rip the paper from the walls and crumble it into dust, just like his life had been crumbled. He reached out his hand, shaking with rage. His fingers closed around a sheet of paper near eye level. It depicted a dark, twisting corridor that looked like a throat. He prepared to rip, but his hand stopped. His eyes, staring at the chaotic lines, caught something. The thick black line he was holding didn't end at the edge of the paper. It continued perfectly onto the sheet next to it, and that line connected to the one below it. Julian frowned. He let go of the paper and took a step back. Then another step. From a distance, the chaos vanished. The scribbles coalesced. The jagged lines straightened out. It wasn't just random noise. It was a map. Julian's breath caught in his throat. It was a floor plan of the Thorne estate, but it was viewed from a perspective he had never seen. It showed the vents, it showed the crawl spaces, it showed the tunnels between the walls that the children must have been using to move around unseen. He stepped closer again, his anger replaced by a chilling fascination. He traced the lines with his finger. Here was the kitchen, here was the library, here was his office. And there in the center of the house was something that wasn't on the official blueprints. Behind the drawing of the massive stone fireplace in the guest wing, the children had drawn a room. But unlike the rest of the map, which was done in black charcoal, this room was colored in violent, angry red wax. It was a hidden chamber, a secret heart of the house that Julian never knew existed. And inside the red box they had drawn a single terrifying symbol, a cage. Julian stared at the red square. The paper felt cold under his fingertips. The fireplace in the guest wing. That was Vanessa's room. That was where he had heard her laughing last night. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They weren't drawing monsters from a fairy tale. They were drawing a map to their own torture chamber. The hallway was cold and the air felt heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The guards were already herding the children toward the front door, where the black van waited like a hearse. It was over. The papers were signed, but then a sound broke the heavy silence. It started with Mia, a low hum that vibrated in her throat. Then Ava joined in, then Liam. It was not a nursery rhyme. It was a haunting rhythmic melody that Simone had taught them in the safety of the nursery. To the staff, it sounded like a nonsense song. To Vanessa, it sounded like the babbling of insane children. But to Julian, who was running down the stairs with the image of the map burned into his retinas, it sounded like a set of coordinates. Look where the fire burns cold. Look where the shadows hold. Julian reached the bottom of the stairs. "Stop!" he shouted. The guards hesitated. Vanessa spun around, her face twisting with impatience. "Julian, please, do not make this harder than it already is. Let them go." Julian ignored her. He pushed past the guards. He didn't look at his fiancée. He looked at Noah. The boy had broken away from the line. He wasn't running toward the door. He was walking steadily into the formal guest parlor, a room that was rarely used. Noah stopped in front of the massive stone fireplace. It was a towering structure of gray slate, cold and imposing. Noah raised his hand. Clutched tight in his small fist was the red Lego brick Simone had given him. He struck the stone mantel. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp and deliberate. It was the same rhythm. SOS. Julian walked into the room. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He remembered Simone's voice echoing in his head. Listen to them, Julian. They are not crazy. They are trying to tell you the truth. He fell to his knees beside his son. He looked at the stone Noah was tapping. It looked solid. It looked permanent. But then Julian saw it. Faint scratch marks on the floor, where the heavy slate had dragged against the wood. Julian placed his hands on the cold stone. He felt Vanessa enter the room behind him. Julian, get up! She hissed, her voice laced with panic. You are having a breakdown. There is nothing there. Julian didn't answer. He pressed his shoulder against the decorative column of the fireplace. He pushed. He pushed with all the fear and guilt and rage that had been building inside him for months. For a second, nothing happened. Then a loud metallic thunk echoed from inside the wall. The hidden spring mechanism released. With a groan of grinding stone, the entire side of the fireplace swung inward. The singing stopped. The room went dead silent. A draft of stale, freezing air rushed out from the dark opening, hitting Julian's face. It didn't smell like a chimney. It smelled of damp earth and mold. It smelled of chemicals. It smelled of a prison. Julian stared into the abyss that had just opened in his living room. A narrow set of wooden stairs led down into the darkness. He had lived in this house for 10 years. He thought he knew every corner, but as he looked at the hidden passage, he realized he had been living on top of a dungeon. He slowly turned his head to look at Vanessa. She was standing in the doorway, clutching her pearls. Her face had lost all its color. The mask of the concerned mother was gone, replaced by the terrified stare of a criminal who has just been caught standing over the body. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs was thick and suffocating. It smelled of stale sweat and old fear, the kind of scent that lingers in places where terrible things happen in the dark. Julian took the last step down onto a cold concrete floor. His hand brushed against the rough wall, searching for a switch. His fingers found a heavy plastic lever and he threw it up. The room did not glow with the warm yellow light of a home. It exploded with a blinding chemical white intensity. Julian threw his arm up to shield his eyes, squinting against the glare. As his vision adjusted, horror began to settle in his gut like lead. This was not a storage room. It was a cell. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thick gray acoustic foam. It was professional-grade soundproofing, designed to keep noise out, but more importantly, to keep screams in. Julian walked into the center of the room. He felt a low vibration in his teeth. He looked up. Mounted in the corners were heavy black speakers. They were emitting a faint, high-pitched hum. It was barely audible to his adult ears, but to the sensitive ears of a child it would have been a constant, piercing shriek, a sound designed to create headaches, a sound designed to drive you mad without leaving a mark. He looked at the cot in the corner. There were no pillows, no blankets, just a bare mattress stained with tears. Beside it lay a pile of colorful trash. Julian kicked the pile with his shoe. They were wrappers, hundreds of them, the shiny foil of the gummy bear vitamins. The floor was littered with the evidence of chemical warfare waged against his own children. Julian felt the room spinning. He grabbed the edge of a metal surgical table to steady himself. That was when he saw it. Lying in the center of the table was a riding crop. It was black leather, braided and stiff. The tip was frayed as if it had been used with great force over and over again. Julian reached out his hand, trembling uncontrollably. He picked it up. The leather felt cold and heavy. He turned the handle over in the harsh light. There, etched into the silver cap of the handle, was a name written in elegant cursive script. Vanessa. The world collapsed. The image of the crescent moon bruise on Mia's head flashed before his eyes. The flinching, the terror, the silence. It had not been madness. It had been torture. Systematized, calculated torture happening 10 feet beneath the floor where he slept. Julian's legs gave out. He fell to his knees on the hard concrete. He clutched the whip to his chest, curling his body around the instrument of his children's pain. A sound built up in his chest, starting as a moan and tearing its way out of his throat. It was a roar of pure agony, a scream that shook the soundproof walls. He screamed for his blindness. He screamed for his failure. He screamed because the monster was not under the bed. The monster was the woman he was about to marry. Julian climbed the wooden steps out of the darkness of the hidden room. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and left his soul behind. His face was gray, and his eyes were hollow. He walked past the guards who were staring at the open wall in shock. He walked past Vanessa, who was trembling near the window. He walked straight to Noah. The little boy did not back away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the red Lego brick. It was small and unassuming, a toy that belonged in a playroom. But Noah held it out with the solemn gravity of a soldier handing over a weapon. Julian took it. His large hand engulfed the small plastic piece. He saw the tiny modification on the side, a micro USB connector hidden within the studs. He reached for his tablet, which was lying on the side table. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for an explanation. He simply plugged the brick into the port. The screen flickered to life. Julian tapped the file named The Truth. The audio filled the silent room before the image resolved. It was the sound of a slap, sharp and cruel. Vanessa flinched. She recognized that sound. The video feed was shaky and low-angled, filmed from the height of a 7-year-old holding a toy at his waist. The camera showed a pair of white silk trousers and expensive heels. Then the figure bent down, filling the frame. It was Vanessa. But it wasn't the Vanessa the world knew. Her face was twisted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated hatred. She was holding Mia by the hair. The little girl was sobbing, trying to twist away. Vanessa jammed a spoon into Mia's mouth, forcing the crushed pills down her throat. "Drink it," Vanessa hissed on the recording, her voice distorted by the cheap microphone but unmistakable. "Stop crying, or I will give you double. I am so sick of looking at your pathetic face." The camera shook, as Noah must have shifted his weight. On the screen, Vanessa stood up and wiped her hands on a towel. She looked directly at a mirror, talking to herself, unaware she was being filmed. "Just a few more days," she muttered. "Then I can ship them off to that prison, and this whole house will be mine. The money, the estate, everything, and I will never have to deal with these little monsters again." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavier than the silence in the dungeon. Vanessa stood frozen near the curtains. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She had just watched her own execution. Julian stared at the black screen for a long time. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a hot line down his cheek. It was a tear for Mia. It was a tear for the years he had wasted. It was a tear for the woman he thought he loved. He raised his hand and wiped the tear away with a slow, deliberate motion. When he lowered his hand, the sadness was gone. The grief was gone. In its place was a cold, barren wasteland of rage. His features hardened into stone. He looked up from the tablet and turned his gaze toward Vanessa. There was no love left in his eyes. There was no mercy. There was only the terrifying calm of a man who has decided to burn the world to the ground to protect what is his. The great hall had been transformed into a studio of blinding white light. A team from Vogue magazine was scurrying around, adjusting reflectors and pinning hemlines. In the center of the chaos stood Vanessa Sterling. She was wearing a custom Vera Wang wedding gown, a cloud of silk and hand-stitched lace that cost more than a small house. She looked radiant. She looked triumphant. She posed for the camera, tilting her head to catch the light, her smile perfect and practiced. She had no idea that her life had ended 10 minutes ago in a dark room beneath the floor. Julian Thorne walked into the room. He didn't stride with his usual confident gait. He walked with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a storm front. He stopped by the main double doors. He didn't greet the photographers. He didn't admire his bride. He reached out and turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking the doors from the inside. The click was loud enough to cut through the chatter of the crew. The photographer lowered his camera. "Excuse me, Mr. Thorne, we need the light from the hallway." Julian ignored him. He walked to the center of the room where a massive 100-inch monitor had been set up to display the raw photos from the shoot. He held his tablet in his hand. He looked at Vanessa. She was still smiling, but the corners of her mouth were twitching. She saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. It wasn't love. It wasn't admiration. It was the cold, dead stare of an executioner. "What are you doing, darling?" Vanessa asked, a nervous laugh bubbling up in her throat. "We are in the middle of a set." Julian didn't speak. He plugged the cable into his tablet. "Look at the screen," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried a terrifying weight. The monitor flickered. The image of the blushing bride vanished. In its place, the grainy footage from the hidden camera appeared. The sound of Vanessa's screaming voice filled the room, amplified by the surround sound speakers. "Drink it. I am so sick of looking at your pathetic face." The room went deathly silent. The makeup artist dropped her brush. The photographer froze. Everyone stared at the screen where the beautiful woman in the white dress was shown dragging a child by her hair and forcing pills down her throat. They watched her admit to the plan. They watched her wish for the children to disappear. Vanessa stood frozen on her pedestal. Her face went as white as her dress. She looked around the room, hoping for an ally, but there were none. The photographers who had been treating her like a queen seconds ago were now looking at her with undisguised horror. Slowly, the lead photographer raised his camera. He didn't aim it at the dress. He aimed it at her face, capturing the raw, ugly fear of a monster exposed. Julian unplugged the tablet. The screen went black, but the image remained burned into everyone's retinas. "You wanted to be famous," Vanessa, Julian said softly. "You wanted the world to look at you. Well, look around. They are all looking, and they will never forget what they saw." The sound of sirens cut through the air, wailing closer and closer until blue and red lights flashed against the high windows, washing out the studio lights. Vanessa panicked. She tried to run toward the side exit, her massive dress rustling like dry leaves, but the doors were blocked. The police burst in. They didn't knock. They didn't ask nicely. They were the tactical unit Julian had called from his office. They moved with military precision, parting the crowd of stunned fashion crew members. Vanessa screamed, "No, you can't touch me. I am Vanessa Sterling. My father is a senator. Julian, tell them. Tell them it is a mistake." She looked at Julian, pleading with her eyes, begging for the man who used to cover up her mistakes. But that man was dead. Julian walked over to her. He stepped onto the pedestal, invading her space. He leaned in close to her ear, smelling the expensive perfume that could no longer mask the scent of her corruption. "You always told me you wanted the children in a secure facility." Julian whispered, his voice like ice. "You said they needed structure. You said they needed containment." He pulled back slightly, looking her dead in the eye. "I made a few calls. The judge agreed with you. But the facility isn't for them, Vanessa. It is for you. I used my influence to ensure you are going to the worst women's correctional facility in the state. No private cell. No silk sheets. Just you and the monsters you belong with." "You bastard!" Vanessa screeched, lunging at him with her claws. The officers tackled her. They didn't care about the Vera Wang dress. They grabbed her arms and twisted them behind her back. The delicate lace tore with a loud ripping sound. The silk skirt was trampled under heavy police boots. Vanessa fought like a wild animal, screaming obscenities, kicking and biting, but they hauled her away. The photographers kept snapping pictures, capturing every second of her downfall. Julian watched her go. He watched until the torn white dress disappeared through the doors and the screaming faded into the back of a squad car. He didn't feel happy. He didn't feel sad. He felt clean. The infection had been cut out. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was the peaceful silence of a storm that has finally passed. Julian stood in the foyer. In his hands he held the clipboard with the ironwood transfer papers. He looked at the signature he had been forced to write. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the paper in half. Then he tore it again and again until the threat to his children was nothing but confetti on the marble floor. He grabbed his car keys. He didn't call a driver. He needed to do this himself. He drove through the rain, which was lightning now breaking into shafts of golden afternoon sun. He drove to the small run-down apartment complex on the edge of the city. He walked up the stairs and knocked on number 4B. Simone opened the door. She was still wearing her wet uniform, her hair drying in frizzy curls. She looked tired, defeated. But when she saw Julian standing there, her eyes widened. "I am sorry," Julian said. It was simple. It was inadequate. But it was true. "I was blind. I was a fool. Please, come home." Simone didn't make him beg. She didn't ask for a raise. She just nodded, grabbed her coat, and followed him. The drive back was silent, but it was a comfortable silence. When they pulled up to the estate, the dark van from Ironwood was gone. The gates stood open. Julian opened the front door for her. Simone stepped into the foyer. For a second, nothing happened. Then came the sound of running feet. Simone. It was a chorus of voices. Liam, Noah, Ava, and Mia came sprinting down the stairs. They didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. They slammed into Simone with the force of a tidal wave, almost knocking her over. They buried their faces in her coat, crying happy tears, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. Simone fell to her knees, hugging all four of them at once, kissing their heads, whispering their names. Then the room went quiet as Liam, the eldest, stepped back. Liam, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 2 years. Liam, who only screamed. He looked up at Simone, his eyes clear and bright. He took a deep breath. "Mama Simone," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You came back." Simone froze. Tears finally spilled over her cheeks, hot and fast. She looked at Julian over the children's heads. Julian stood by the door watching the scene. His heart, which had been frozen for so long, finally began to beat again. He smiled. It wasn't a business smile. It was a real, genuine smile. He stepped back and slowly closed the heavy front door, shutting out the world, shutting out the past, and sealing his family safe inside the warmth of their home. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of happy laughter echoing in the dark. The story of the Thorne family serves as a chilling and powerful reminder that the most dangerous monsters often hide behind the most beautiful masks. We live in a world that places immense value on status, appearance, and pedigree. Julian almost lost his entire world because he was conditioned to trust the polished exterior of a senator's daughter over the rough, genuine integrity of a woman from the working class. The most profound lesson here is that character is not defined by what you wear or who your parents are, but by how you treat those who are powerless against you. Vanessa saw the children as props for her vanity, while Simone saw them as human beings in need of protection. Furthermore, this narrative teaches us the critical importance of listening to the things that remain unspoken. The adults in the room, blinded by their own busy lives and preconceived notions, labeled the children as crazy or broken. They saw the tantrums and the silence as symptoms of a disease rather than a desperate language of distress. It took someone like Simone, who listened with her heart rather than her ego, to decode the signals. She understood that bad behavior in a child is often a scream for help that they do not have the vocabulary to articulate. It reminds us that we must look closer at the people around us, to look past the surface level of inconvenience, and ask what is truly happening beneath the noise. Ultimately, the story redefines what it means to be a family. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, sacrifice, and love make you family. Simone became the mother those children needed, not because she gave birth to them, but because she was willing to walk through fire, break down doors, and risk her own freedom to ensure their safety. It is a testament to the fact that love is an action, not just a feeling. It is about showing up when it is hard, speaking up when it is dangerous, and refusing to leave when the storm hits. Truth may be suppressed, hidden behind soundproof walls, and buried under lies. But as long as there is one person brave enough to hold the light, the darkness cannot win. If this story resonated with you, or reminded you of a time you had to trust your own intuition against the odds, please share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about the hidden truths of the human heart.